Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about creating an AI strategy, which strikes me as a pretty complicated subject here in 2024. AI technology is evolving so rapidly, and there are so many issues around cost, compliance, which large language model to choose. To discuss all that, to provide insight into all that, I'm joined by Lee Caswell, Senior Vice President, Product and Solutions at Nutanix. Lee, very good to have you with us today.
James, always a pleasure. And this topic is really spot on for the moment.
It is hot. I mean, everyone, all the kids are dancing to it. Everyone has ChatGPT on their phone. It is pretty topical. Lee, tell me, by the way, have you played much with ChatGPT?
Absolutely. And, I ask audiences that I talk to these days, right, and customers, and just really checking in. And here's what's interesting. Like most people in our space, right, have tried it. Why? Because they heard about like just the way that this transformed the way you think about technology. And we all have, we've had AI for years, right? But the idea that generative AI gives you results so fast, really just spot on, right? Really gets people's attention.
One other fast fact I just have to share is that I was looking to this up, and the large language model for ChatGPT-3 had something like 175 billion parameters. And for ChatGPT-4, it was like 1.8 trillion parameters. So one version away and like 10 times the parameters for the LLM. It kind of gives you an idea of the rate of change and progress in this sector.
Yeah, we've actually redefined large within the last year, right?
True.
What does large mean, right? And so what you're starting to see, I think, right, is that the model development, right, the pace at which these models are evolving and the scale at which they're evolving, right, means that for most enterprises, right, this is out of the reach of the enterprise, not just because of cost, by the way, right, but accessibility to GPUs is an issue, as you know, right, and then just the power, right, the powering of GPT-4, I heard somewhere was like 10 megawatts or something like that, for a small Midwestern city or something. But this is really now. The idea is, how do I take advantage of this technology that's developing, bring it home, right, so that you can make an impact into your business? That's where a lot of people are a little bit stumped.
And that brings us really to the idea of an AI strategy. And I know you've used the phrase pliable and resilient, which I find that really interesting. So what does it mean for companies to make their AI strategies pliable and resilient, especially as more and more AI models get introduced to the market?
Yeah, I think, you remember hearing in management models, right? Like, loose, tight, right? They're like, well, how do you do that? How do you manage people in a loose, tight way? We have a similar issue here, which is how do you have the flexibility so that data scientists can go and deploy models very quickly, right? Seamlessly, and not have to worry about things like infrastructure and compliance and day two operations. While the infrastructure folks, right, are being chartered with, hey, let's make sure that this new application doesn't get out of hand, out of control, right? How do I make sure that there's controls in here? So one of the things we're trying to, and at Nutanix helping customers do is figure out how you can go and take the latest in these large language models, bring them in, never do the wrong one in a sense, and then be able to apply the day two operations and auditing, compliance, and issues that are going to make this, important as you would for any business critical app.
Well, I think that's on the subject of large language models. It amazes me the amount of confusion about that. It seems like people talk about AI, and it seems like the hottest topic within that is LLMs, and companies don't know, do we bring our own? Do we pick one? Do we off the shelf? Sure. Is it open source? And all sorts of questions like that. So why should organizations allow users to adopt a bring your own large language model mindset? And what does that even mean?
Well, I think we start with the data, start thinking about the data, because, the data that you're going to be using, if it's your own public data, all of a sudden you have a different lens in how you think about large language models, because large language models are generally built on public data. And you can take those and now start retuning them on your own data. Now, the issue is, do you want to expose that data into the public domain to be used at large? Well, most companies, if you start getting into financial services or healthcare, right, or government agencies, they're looking and saying, hey, the data that I have is really actually very sensitive. And it turns out, James, right, the model may be even more sensitive than the data itself. Because at some point, the model shows the inferencing you're basically developing. What sort of conclusions can you derive from your data? So the ability to go and basically retune these public models with your own private data, and then be able to both store them and run them in a private environment, which could include extending it out back to the edge or even back into the public cloud, starts basically giving you an idea that this is a distributed model with an inherent hybrid cloud workflow. It's kind of interesting, right? And so now we started thinking about, how does the data transfer? How does the applications, how do they move across this? And it turns out a cloud platform can help with that.
Well, you mentioned the idea of retuning or tuning the large language model, which at some level means inputting your own information into it. What do you say to that executive who the very thought of that, makes him or her, pretty much feel terror? It's like, we don't want to put our data into this LLM.
I think you start responsibly, right, is usually the first thing, right? And so some of the hesitations have to do with, well, what should I do first? And this is really important. What we're finding is that companies that find an application that's going to improve profitability, for example, or drive revenue, right, or increase customer support or SAT numbers, those pick that application really carefully up front, because if it's not a business problem, applying AI to it doesn't make it better, right? So find that business issue. And so one that's been top of mind for a lot of companies is, how do they improve the support experience for customers? They've got a lot of private data around the support experience. You could go and say, hey, this data available to our own support representatives, if we could deliver it faster, help people find data that's already there and do it faster, the customer experience will improve. So we're watching that as like one of the workflows. Another one, for example, is intelligent document processing, claims processing, for example. How do you process claims and look for patterns in claims, right, around whether a claim is validated or not, right, or whether there may be fraud right in the system. So if you can find an application, and then we can show how AI could apply basically speed and now resilience, right? You can start to see how this becomes a really important business critical application very quickly for companies.
All right, so you sort of talked about the subject of needing to take time before onboarding a new AI solution.
Sure.
Your advice for that? You've touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to really dig into that topic.
I think there's a few things you want to think about. Number one, the industry is changing very fast. AI from a year ago, right, as you mentioned, right, is materially different than it was, than it is today, right?
Right.
And a year from now, it'll be materially different than it is today, right? So
Definitely.
Start looking and making sure that you can accommodate the latest hardware and software changes very fast. So, we have a software-defined architecture that allows us to take the latest in GPU developments, the latest in CPU developments, the latest in motherboard designs and networks. You get all that hardware flexibility first. Second, we have I call this bring your own LLM, or BYOL, right? Bring your own LLM means that we can now go and integrate with companies like NVIDIA, right, for their NIM architecture, or with Hugging Face for a whole series of different models. And you can start looking at what application would be the best for you. And the good news is you can swap it out over time, right? Because what we're providing is the underlying infrastructure that allows you to basically deploy this. And one of the technologies that companies need to understand pretty quickly, right, is containers and Kubernetes as well. It's interesting. It's not the first thing you think about. Normally, AI is the why you start moving towards this.
Right.
And containers become the how, because containers help deploy these applications very quickly and deploy them across different locations. So as you start looking at this, being able to take AI applications, run the latest container technologies as support, and then be able to swap out these pieces and upgrade them over time becomes very important to be flexible in an AI environment.
Actually, let me take a moment out of that for just my own education, and that I think about Kubernetes. That's back when we paid attention to cloud, and it feels like cloud has lost some profile in the world, not in reality, but in terms of the public consciousness, because AI has sucked all the energy out of the room. Kubernetes was big in the cloud world. What's the relationship between Kubernetes and AI? You're saying you can deploy an AI application faster because it's wrapped in a container?
Yeah, it turns out, right, that modern applications are most often developed, and particularly in the cloud, are developed using containers. And the reason why is, right, it removes some OS dependencies, which allows you to build the applications faster. And then you can deploy them in different end states without having to worry about as many testing configurations. And so it's about the agility of development. Okay, now what customers have been looking at is, well, hey, if I'm doing VMs today, which is traditionally how modern application or traditional applications are run, how do I take containers and basically manage them in exactly the same way? This is something we do today, very seamless, right? So you can take a container and you can add all of the same data services around it, the same security model, the same compliance model, and basically assimilate. We're calling this, by the way, VM container convergence. And that means you can go and take and manage multiple things in a simultaneous, consistent manner.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other advice in terms of onboarding a new AI solution?
Well, I think this, right? Data. So let's see if you agree with this, James. I think data is the only asset I'm aware of that increases in value over time. Other physical asset depreciates over time, right? Law of entropy, basically. Right. But as you look at data, right, our ability to now go and take new models and apply it to even existing data means you can get new insights out of that data. And so the idea that you can basically have the infrastructure to run new models over time becomes very powerful as you start thinking about focusing on the thing that matters, which is the data and the applications. And take your mind off the infrastructure because we'll take care of that for you.
What about the idea of making sure you do your due diligence for your Gen AI strategy? I mean, that's a big topic. Some thoughts on that one?
Well, there's some areas that we particularly can't help with, by the way, right? So we're not doing all of the work here, right? So hallucinations, for example, are something to think through, right? How do you make sure that you're basically looking to get responsible output from the data? That requires some judgment, right, and work, right, from a company standpoint. So you want to have people at an enterprise focused on that. We're taking care of the infrastructure level. You've got the models. Now there's this integration to make sure it's the right questions for your business needs and making sure you're solving that. I think these are the areas where customers can start focusing on. What we're finding is customers know their own business and their own customers. They're trying to have partners go and develop the models. That's a whole partner ecosystem that we have in Nutanix. And then they're looking for Nutanix to provide the compute, storage, networking, all integrated with day two operations compliance. That is one way, a winning plan, right? To go get started today so you can figure out how AI can basically change your business next year.
Well, it seems like one of the difficulties with creating a strategy around generative AI is that the technology itself changes so quickly. It's anything but static. And so I can plan, I've got 5 tractors up in my farm. I can plan, I use these 2 for the soybeans, these 2 for the corn. I can plan for those 5 tractors because they're a static entity. But how can I plan even for 18 months for generative AI when generative AI, as you mentioned, is going to be quite different 18 months from now?
Yeah, well, I think here's the thing, right? That as you get started, you can find out, right, that the most important part to lock into is what's the data source that you'll have. This is where Nutanix comes out, right? Good data. Remember this garbage in, garbage out, right? kind of idea, right? So really, as you started thinking, hey, we've got this data. The data that you have on, let's say, support isn't changing, right? Or the data that you're collecting, let's say it was a retail fraud, video fraud detection system. That data is available right now. And so the part that you think about is, hey, I want to go and make sure I know how to use my data effectively and then bring in models over time. And so it's actually very valuable to get started today. And we're finding that CEOs, right, are initiating AI initiatives inside companies, right? And so what we're encouraging our teams to do is find that initiative, find out how core it is to the business, and we can help you solve that in a very fast, efficient manner.
All right. Well, then the big question that is the future. If we do look, say, a 1 year, 1 to 3 years out, which is a pretty brave thing to do with artificial intelligence, what do you see for the future of AI in the enterprise? What's it going to look like in 2027 or so? Or how can we prepare for that now?
Yeah, and I think if I paraphrased your question, it's kind of like, what's the future of AI in the enterprise? I'm going to turn it exactly the opposite around. What's the future of an enterprise in an AI world?
Right. Really important. Okay, good.
Right. So think about that for a minute, right? That without AI, enterprises have a pretty kind of, I would say, a standard like growth path and plan, right? A 5-year plan and such. But I will suggest, right, that businesses are going to use AI in ways that make startups and newcomers much more effective, more quickly, with fewer people, and they're going to faster. So the idea, right, of standing on the sidelines on this one, not like Web 2.0, if you remember that, right, or things like that weren't real. This is
the metaverse. Remember the metaverse?
Right? Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So this is the thing, and that's why, by the way, ChatGPT made such a big impression, was because it doesn't take a data scientist to go access ChatGPT. You've got normal people like you and I can go in and look at ChatGPT and say, hey, this is a game changer. Now, we have to apply it responsibly to real business problems. Infrastructure is a key element to go make sure that you can get started responsibly.
I think your point about a small team equipped with AI tools is going to be able to compete with far bigger players. It is curious to know how that'll shift things, but I think that is certainly true, and I think it will cause some pretty big disruptions in the enterprise. Yeah,
and so listen, it's kind of the excitement there. Also, a little bit of trepidation for companies. What we're doing with we have a product called GPT in a box. Not literally a box, by the way, but what it is, it's a pre-configured software architecture with certified GPU-enabled hardware. You can go get started today. Pick an LLM of your choice. We can go and help you be successful with that. Show how you can be successful maybe with a prototype, and then move that into production going forward. It's a really quick onboarding path to say, here's how we're going to make AI work for you, as opposed to waiting for someone else to show you how it's done.
Interesting. Lee, I think you said it. It is going to be a fascinating sector to follow in the years ahead, no doubt about it. I greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, James. Thanks so much.